Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff. It is the week of November 27th, 2024, Thanksgiving week here in the US. And before we begin tonight, I just want to say a couple things. First of all, it's been really wonderful to meet so many of you on the road over the past just about 2 months now. In mid-October, right after the Chagim, I flew from Israel to begin a comedy and book tour in the US. And as I've been going around, I've met so many of you who listen and are telling me that you really are enjoying the pod. And it means a lot to me on a personal level because, unlike comedy, when you're up on stage, if you're getting laughs, it means you're doing well and people like you. And if you're not getting laughs, you know you need to change plans, right? But with the podcast, it's basically a guy sitting alone with a mic in a living room or hotel room or wherever I may be that weekend. So you never really know who's out there and who's listening and what kind of impact it's making. So to meet so many of you coming up to me at my event, telling me that you really are enjoying it on a personal level, it's fulfilling. But more importantly, what I'm hearing is that you really like hearing this inside angle, that you like hearing the story behind the headlines. Even in Israeli media, you can't really get the full story. There's just not enough time. There's not enough space. There's not enough manpower to bring you the kind of details that I want to bring you here and the up close and personal look at the news stories, how it's affecting the average, Tali and Yossi on the street. And that's really what I want to do here. And I know we have a lot of new listeners this week as well, people I've met over the past few weeks who've signed up, and this might be the first time they're listening. And so if this is your first time, that is the mission statement for Inside Israel, to bring you an up close look at not the news headlines itself, because I really think you can get those many other places, good places at that, but the story you didn't even know you didn't know, to meet people you might not have heard of, and to get an intimate look at how the news is affecting Israelis. And also, the news stories that aren't even making it into the media, the little tidbits from daily life that really make Israel what it is and make Israeliness what it is, but you really wouldn't hear about anywhere else. And tonight's episode is very much along those lines. The title of tonight's episode is Yogev. This is episode 58 now of Inside Israel. And I must say, it's one of the most meaningful, I think, and one of the most special, certainly one of the most unique that I've done so far. So, a little background. Just over a week ago, Captain Yogev Pazy, Zichrono Livracha, was killed in Gaza. He was an IDF soldier in the Kfir Brigade. It's a brigade I happen to know well because I have some very close friends who were serving in that brigade during their own service. And it turns out that Yogev has a connection with my hometown, the north suburbs of Chicago. When he was 18 years old, Yogev was part of what's called the shin-shinim program. Shin-shinim is an acronym, shin-shin. It stands for Shnat Sheirut, or Year of Service. 18-year-olds from Israel, after going through a series of interviews and making it past all the cuts, the ones who qualify come to the US and they live in the US for an entire year. As emissaries, their job really is to bring Israeli culture to whatever community they're assigned to, and also to put a face on Israel, especially for kids in summer camps, kids in Hebrew schools and day schools. And Yogev was one of those kids who, at the age of 18, left his home in Israel, and he was assigned to the northern suburbs of Chicago and worked in the school as a volunteer that I went to as a kid, Solomon Schechter Day School in Northbrook. I went to the Skokie one, but it later merged with the Northbrook one. He worked over the summer at Camp Bieber in Wisconsin, which I'm familiar with as well. That's where we took our little fifth and sixth grade trip at Solomon Schechter. We'd go up to Bieber for our overnight. So that's a camp that I'm familiar with too. So he really touched a lot of history from my own life. And during that year that Yogev lived in Chicago, he actually housed with two different families. And one of the families he lived with was the Perlen family, Tobi and Scott Perlen of Northbrook, Illinois. And tonight I invited the Perlens onto Inside Israel to talk to them about Yogev, what it was like to get to know this young man and to have him become a part of their family over that 6 months. And as you'll hear, not just during those 6 months, but afterwards as well. I think it's really important that, to date, 378 soldiers have been killed in Gaza. And it's so easy just to think of them as statistics or to shake our heads and say, wow, such a shame, and then go on with the rest of our day. But we really have a beautiful opportunity here to get to know a little bit about Yogev from people who had a chance to know him intimately and know him in a way that sadly the rest of us won't. So now I'm going to invite on Toby and Scott Perlen. Hello, guys.
Hi,
Hi,
how are
thanks
you?
for having us.
Of
Yes.
course, of course. And I guess the first thing I want to say is I really do want to say I'm sorry for your loss because it's a loss not just for the community you hosted him, but for you guys. Because from what I heard from talking to you before, he really did feel like part of your family.
Thank you. We appreciate
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. It hit hard when we first found out the news, and we're excited to share Yogev's story, or at least what our experience with Yogev was with the crowd tonight.
So what I'd like to begin with is just give us an overall impression of who he was. What was he like? What made him special?
Yeah, well, maybe I take one step back and just set it up on how he got to us.
Sure.
We we had going back about 4 years precisely, 2020, we're in the midst of what I call kind of the COVID school year, where many kids were at home, including one of ours. We had two that were going to the Jewish day school. But for the most part, things were mostly confined to the home front. And when presented with the opportunity to house a shin-shinim, like we talked about it and we discussed the pros and cons. We've never done anything like this before. We had a ninth grader, a seventh grader, and a fifth grader, and we kind of weighed the pros, cons of, him being around and in our space versus him being around and spreading his aura to the kids and to us. And ultimately, we obviously decided it's a good trade for us. So he moved in with us November 2020, and it was when we first met him, it was like a burst of energy just walked through the door.
Wow.
He was filled with excitement, and he was approaching this opportunity to live with us similar to how we were approaching it having him, which is excitement, a little bit of nervous energy. But ultimately, we were all extroverted and wanting to make it work. So, like, I'll turn over to my wife, but like the initial reaction was this young man is gregarious and like full of life and will be just given just like the COVID backdrop, just that shot of energy that the home needed. And that's kind of how like day one I thought of it.
And I want to point out, this isn't for a weekend or 2 weeks. I mean, this is for 6 months that you're hosting this stranger. So that's a huge leap for your family, but also for an 18-year-old kid 10,000 miles away from his home.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Yeah. He came into our home with such excitement and ready to learn and ready to teach us. He was amazing. Of course, as like a mom, I just wanted him to be comfortable and what do you like and what did what can I do? What can I do? And he just was so easy and he might have gotten from us. We got more from him. He was truly the most amazing young man.
And one parallel, just to mention, he's the oldest of four
Yeah.
siblings. So he kind of stepped into that same role within our home, where he effectively was the oldest of four children of ours living at the time. So it was a role he was familiar with, And each of our kids, and we'll probably get into it, he had a unique relationship with.
Well, I wanted to ask about the children because what was it like for them to suddenly have this new semi-big brother walk into their lives?
I think our older one tends to be a little more, cautious, whatever. So it was a little maybe different for him, but he had definitely warmed up quickly. The other two were just like so excited. I mean, we're gonna have this Israeli living with us, and they were excited. They were really, really excited. And the fact that Yogev worked in the school that they were at just made everything even more wonderful for them. They not only bonded at home over like typical sibling, things, but then at school that he could really share experiences with them there, which were amazing.
I would sort of say he was like a new toy for the younger two
Right.
that they could play with. And like like Toby was saying, our oldest, he was a freshman in high school. He was kind of he aged out of playing and was more into that phase of life. And Yogev came in and was like the camp counselor to the two of them, which was great.
Did he know? Did he have it naturally, Yogev? Did he have that ability to relate
Yes,
to the different ages? I mean, tell me about that because
yes.
that can be hard.
Yeah, I don't know how he was just amazing. It's like it was just so natural for him. He would just know how to talk to our oldest Jake, that was the freshman. Yet then he could talk to our youngest that was in fifth grade at that time. And then our middle is a daughter. And it's interesting because Scott was saying, Yogev was the oldest of four kids, and it went Yogev and then Noam and then Moore, who's a girl, and then Barak is the youngest. That was basically the setup in our house, right? It went
Right.
boy, boy, girl, boy with Yogev and the. So he even knew how to relate well to our daughter Gabby, and it was just he was amazing. I don't even know what else to say except
Well, yesterday when you and I spoke a little bit just to get to know each other, you used the word impact a couple of times. And I'm just curious, how did he impact the school, the camp, the community? Like, where did you actually feel an impact being made?
I mean, not so I could just tell you, not only did he impact our home in bringing a new like vibrance and love of life. We are already like very Zionistic, but he brought it even more, obviously, being who he is. Just that care and love of Israel, love of, Judaism. But I can tell you that I have heard from so many people how he's touched different kids along the way that I didn't even know during the time. How he helped this one, she was struggling, or he helped this child who, needed a little extra support. I mean, I've been told these stories over the past week, which I didn't know.
Mhm.
I was only speaking more from like at first my, experiences with him, where he just brought such a new energy. It's like the only way you can say it is like he brought this energy, which was magical and contagious.
And I would also add, so think about this. He's 18 at the time,
Right.
um, having just finished school. This was a bridge before the military. So, sort of an awkward time where he's still somewhat of a kid, but about to embark on, quite a mature endeavor. And I think we felt both sides of it in the home, where he could be a goof and a kid and play fun, weird games with our kids and be the camp counselor. And then at the same time, when talking about what's ahead of him, convey the importance to him of it and the seriousness of it and how much it meant to him. So he was able to sort of turn it on and turn it off, I think in a healthy way, as it pertained to, the military and also being a kid.
Did he talk about his upcoming army service, like why it was important to him? I'd love to hear what he was envisioning for his service and whether he planned to become an officer or if that was a spontaneous decision. Like what was his views? What were his views of defending the country and going into the
Well,
army
let me
before?
just, yeah, let me tee this up for Toby because I wasn't as familiar. The unit he was going into, which my understanding is a highly competitive
Hmm.
unit to get into, is something he did not take lightly. And
He wanted,
he
he was,
wanted it. He was competitive about getting it, and he was very prideful about experiencing it. Um, I didn't know the extent of his family being kind of having military exposure and kind of other events that his family has dealt with in the military. But from what I've read post this tragedy, um, like the family's dealt with a lot, and that didn't stop him at all. He felt this was his obligation and was so prideful about serving and protecting Israelis and protecting
American Jews.
American Jews. It really was sincere and important for him. And as an 18-year-old,
Yeah.
like shocking.
So different from 18-year-olds in America. He would talk to me about his wanting to make a career in the military. And so I knew that he was going in a very, prestigious unit, that he wanted to become an officer. He would tell me all about what he sort of dreamed of. Building up another area in the Negev and creating more, making it prosperous. And he just had such
Aspirations.
aspirations. I don't even say dreams. Like it's like he knew what he wanted to do and he was going to do it.
And just to give a little background to our listeners, his uncle is Gadi Eisenkot, who was the former chief of staff of the IDF, and his cousin was killed in Gaza earlier in the year. So yes, the family has suffered numerous burdens, casualties throughout this war in Gaza. I know he impacted you, he impacted the community. Do you think the experience impacted him? Like, how did it change him being in Chicago for that year, seeing Jews outside of the Jewish homeland? How did that change him, if it did at all?
Yeah, I think twofold. I think first off, um, as an Israeli just hunkering down in the States for an extended period of time, he had a good time. There was a group of his peers that were also in the Chicagoland area. They did some traveling, they did some socializing, they became kind of a unit of their own right here. So I think he had a good time and got to see America at its best, or kind of during COVID
Yeah,
at
because
its
I
best,
A
like
version, yeah.
there because although they did get to bond, they were an incredible group when they first got here, and then when they went into all their host families, they did have a lot of like rules because of COVID. So
Right.
I would say in the beginning that was really hard. That like they didn't really have each other to actually get together in the very beginning because of all the COVID stuff. So they were really mostly in our homes. But then as time and things started letting up, they were obviously allowed to socialize, which I loved because he would bring all the shin-shinim to our home. They'd sit in the backyard. Like I would go outside and I'd get to like sort of like learn from them and experience them. And they did travel and they did enjoy. I listen, do I know what changed him from being here? I don't, but I do know that his time in Chicago was very, very important and impactful from what his family has also told me.
I also think like um, it was important for him to see a Jewish community in America and kind of how we appreciate our Judaism and how we appreciate the state of Israel. He got exposure to that. And I think sometimes when you live in Israel, you could think I'm all alone. I'm in this small area of land and we're really kind of isolated and alone. But I do feel like he got a taste of the fact that here in America, Jews care and Jews have an emotional and meaningful tie to the state of Israel.
And I've pointed out on this podcast many times, those of you who listen regularly, you know that really until October 7th, I think a lot of Israelis weren't so aware of how much world Jewry and American Jewry in particular, rooted for Israel and felt like they supported Israel. But since then, it really it has been something that Israelis have been awakened to, unless they had a chance to come here and experience it themselves, like it seems that Yogev did, which I think is very healthy for both sides. And you mentioned yesterday when we talked that your relationship continued even after he left. So tell me what that departure was like and how you managed to stay in touch afterwards.
I mean, it was sad to say goodbye, obviously, but we were excited for him. He was so excited to go back to Israel and, get into the IDF. As soon as he got back, we developed a WhatsApp chat with him, which Yogev, when he was here, he made this like bagel egg sandwich, which quickly became the yogeg in our house.
That's great.
Which my kids, we make on a regular basis. Like my son would come down and be like, Mom, will you make me a yogeg? I'm like, of course, whatever. So our chat became the yogeg chat. And we would WhatsApp and communicate. It was all six of us on it on a regular basis. He would tell us what's going on with him. We would tell him he'd always want to know what's happening with us. And obviously, after October 7th, we continued to talk and he'd let us know where he was. And up until the Friday before he was killed, that was our last communication. He sent us a selfie saying, from love from Gaza. We all answered, I love you, Yogev. Thank you for what you're doing. Shabbat Shalom. It was a Friday. And our WhatsApp finished with a heart emoji from him. And that's where our communication ended. But anytime I would say to him, how are you? He'd be in Gaza and I'd say, how are you, Yogev? I'm great. How are you? Tell me about you. And even though it was so hard for me to think, okay, I'm going to tell you about this, like, my kid's going to, some stupid basketball. I felt I needed to tell him like these little things that were happening here. I really truly believe he wanted to really know what was happening in our lives, even if it was so not important compared to what he was doing for us.
And there has never been one moment of frustration or complaining or negativity sent in this chat from him to us. No, I'm tired or I could use a break or any of that. It was positivity and what's happening in Chicago. And that is a great testament to the character of Yogev.
I do want to ask you about the moment you got the news, if you don't mind sharing it, because I think it's important for listeners to know that side of the story as well. So if you don't mind, I think Tobi, it was you.
Yeah. So, I'm from Minneapolis. So we were back in Minneapolis. It was my nephew's bar mitzvah last weekend. So we were all there, and Sunday morning, Scott had to leave early. He had to fly west for work. So I was still home or at my mom's, and we were having a brunch. And I'm making my typical, brunch stuff, whatever, with my families all around because everyone is in from out of town. And I felt a buzz on my phone. It was 9 o'clock because I had to leave at 9:20. So I like remember the time. And I flipped over my phone and I saw it's a WhatsApp call from his mom, Kayuta. And I thought, oh,
Can't be good.
yeah. So I answered it right away and I heard her voice and I said, Kayuta, what? And then, obviously she said Yogev. And that's how I found out. She told me, and I think I sat there. I went into another room. I sat there sort of in shock, obviously, cried with her, and then, I hung up with her. I mean, she had just found out a few hours before, I believe. She said to me, which is absolutely incredible of her, I wanted to call you and tell you before you heard it in the news, because it was going to be all over the social media everywhere in the
Right.
news very quickly. And for her to even think of me during that time was just such horrific news. But I was so appreciative of that. And then it was just a hard, it's been a hard week. It's been a hard week.
Scott, how did you take it, if you don't mind sharing?
I was flustered. I'm pretty of the two of us, she's the more emotional one. I'm the more introverted one, and it rocked me. Our family and Toby and I specifically have never had to deal with, we've been lucky. We've never had any real tough times to deal with. And this was the first kind of test of, I think, our emotional strength ever. It just makes you think about a lot of things. And, what comes to mind most is just how much how much the world is going to miss by Yogev not being in it. He's such an amazing human, unique, like absolutely one of the most unique humans I've ever met. Um, so we're dealing with it. Time helps somewhat, but I think we try and think about him every day. And this Friday, we're doing sort of like a Shiva situation here at our home for a number of the people who knew him. It's not a Shiva
It's
technically,
like
but
just a gathering
it's
to
a
honor him.
gathering to
Yeah.
honor him.
Because a lot of people have come, people that we didn't even know knew him and whatever, and I've gotten Facebook messages from people, and so the other family that was very close with him, um, her and I have been working to coordinate to honor him. I tried, as soon as I heard the news, after I sort of pulled myself together, tried to see if I could, how do I get to Israel? I got to get to Israel. I got to get to Israel. And I couldn't even get to Israel in time for the funeral. So, or even this week, it's impossible. So, yeah.
Before I let you go, is there one memory you can share, one episode, even if it's tiny, that can just give us a taste of who Yogev was and what you're going to carry in your memory as you move forward?
Well, I'll just give a light memory and then one that was one of the last memories. So the light memory was Yogev was a big basketball fan. Basketball is pretty popular in Israel, and coming to America to see an NBA game was on his bucket list.
For sure.
Um, just given COVID, like getting to games was really hard. There weren't many opportunities. However, in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, the NBA team there did open up for fans, but like on a limited basis. And I ended up taking him and my two sons to a Milwaukee Bucks game, and it was hysterical how much fun he had. Like when they would shoot the t-shirts in the stand and like all the gimmicks at the arena, he was all in on. And it was fun to see that was, the kid in him having a great time. And then lastly, I think it was towards the end of his stay, he wanted to make us an Israeli meal. And he went all out and made us a five-star full spread Israeli meal. It was probably Shabbat.
It was
Yeah.
Shabbat.
And it was something I don't think we'll ever forget. Um, so those are a couple just memories that I wanted to share.
Toby and Scott, I really want to thank you for being with us. I know it was hard. I know it probably feels like a lot of time has passed since you heard that he fell, even though it's only been, I think, just over a week. Time has a way of expanding like that, and I truly appreciate it. I know all the listeners do as well for giving us a little bit of an insight into who Yogev was and the memories you'll carry forward. So, toda rabba.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thanks for everyone for listening, and this has been fun and
I'm
great to honor Yoga.
I'm going to take a quick break. I'll be back in about 1 minute. Stick around. Welcome back to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff. And again, I want to thank Toby and Scott Perlen for talking to us about Yogev Zichrono Livracha. And while they were talking, I made a few notes of just things that I wanted to share with you, the listeners, in this next part of the podcast. One thing that Toby mentioned was Yogev's spirit and desire to serve in the IDF. And one of the conversations we've had on this podcast many times is about the unrest in Israel right now, about the ultra-Orthodox serving. I've given the stat before that last year alone, 66,000 of the ultra-Orthodox did not serve in the army. They were eligible. They could have served, but they were given exemptions in order to study in yeshiva for political reasons. Meanwhile, the IDF is 20,000 soldiers short for the number of soldiers it needs right now to fight the wars in Lebanon and in Gaza. And yes, there is a ceasefire possible with Lebanon, but nevertheless, we have troops there. And we are 20,000 soldiers short. And so, one of the big issues in Israel right now is that we're extending the service of the 18-year-olds who are serving. We're raising the age for military reserve duty. And yet at the same time, the ultra-Orthodox are not serving. But Toby brought up an interesting point, which I don't think we've talked about before, is that one of the challenges of drafting the ultra Orthodox into the army isn't just that they don't want to, it's not that they're able to get exemptions, it's that they don't have that spirit inside them, that it's not just a matter of putting someone in handcuffs and marching them to the induction center and forcing them into a uniform. You have to want to serve. And one of the biggest challenges is instilling that kind of spirit that Yogev and so many of his peers have. For a kid like Yogev and others like him, serving in the army, it's a matter of pride. You don't do it because it's the law. You don't do it because you get a draft notice. You do it because you would be embarrassed to not do it. It's who you are, and it's the character of the country, and it's the character of you. It's in your DNA. And you'd be sort of ashamed to show your face in the neighborhood if you got out of the army or were not drafted. I know situations of kids who trained really hard to get into the best unit possible. And then when they showed up for their doctor's appointment, it turned out they had slight scoliosis or flat feet or a vertebrae that was off in their back. And so they couldn't be in the elite unit they dreamed of. And so they fought and fought to try to get in some other combat unit that would take them. Uh, that's what's missing from the ultra orthodox as well. We can mail them as many draft notices as we can. We can even arrest them, put them in jail, bus them to the induction center. But if they don't want to be there, I'm not so sure how much of an asset to the army they would actually be. So this problem is much deeper than just numbers. It's really about the ethos that's missing there, and in a different ethos that exists in these various different segments of society. Another point that Scott and Toby brought up that I want to mention, we give a lot of attention to birthright. Birthright is a very sexy idea. Take kids who've never been to Israel, give them a free trip, bring them to Israel. But I personally think that one of the healthiest things for Israel is a reverse birthright, bringing Israelis to America and other communities outside of Israel. I think it's so important for them to see, as Toby and Scott mentioned, one, that we support them and we are rooting for them and thinking about them, and that we care about Israel, Israelis, and Israeli soldiers. A lot of Israelis don't know this, and they certainly didn't before October 7th. It wasn't on their minds. But also to know that there are different ways to be Jewish. One of the things I've heard from Israelis who go to summer camps in the US is that it really opened their eyes to a different way of being Jewish, that boys and girls can sit together, that you can have a guitar during services, that you don't have to sit there listening to a stodgy service that you don't relate to, but that there can be singing and spirit. And it really opens their eyes to the idea that Judaism is more than just a black and white orthodox or nothing paradigm that so many Israelis, grow up with. So if I were the Pope of the Jews, if I were in charge of the Jewish people, I would say that as much money as we're investing in birthright and programs like that, we should invest in reverse birthright type programs where we bring young Israelis to the US, Canada, Australia, England, wherever there are strong Jewish communities, to show them what it's like to be Jewish elsewhere, and then they can take that back home to Israel. I think it makes Israel stronger. And the third point I want to touch on from the conversation is Toby and Scott mentioned how Yogev really in Gaza wanted to hear about their kids' basketball games and sort of these mundane aspects, and maybe even quote unquote stupid aspects of daily life that really aren't nearly as meaningful as serving in a combat unit in Gaza. At least that's how we might see it. But as someone who's in the army myself and who knows people in the army right now and who had kids go through the army, these stories of the mundane, they're so important. So many of you ask me, what can we do for Israel? Where should we give money? Should we go visit? Should we take tours? Yes, all of that is important. But I think Toby and Scott reminded me that another very important thing you can do is just stay in touch with your friends in Israel and tell them about the mundane, silly, stupid stuff you're doing in your life, the crazy line at the grocery store, your kids' sports games, whatever it is, because it reassures them, it reminds them that there's this whole world out there besides just the chaos that they are living in Israel, and specifically for soldiers. I remember when I was a soldier, I loved getting letters. This is letters back before there was email and text messages. I loved getting letters about the silly, mundane aspects of life from my family and friends back in the US, because it was like reading a short novel, this little escape from the sort of quote unquote hell I was in the army, and a chance to think about other environments and what other people are doing in that big outside world. So that's another thing you can do for Israel and Israelis, is just stay in touch with them and tell them the stories of your own lives. Believe it or not, it does mean a lot to them. And just in terms of what Israel is going through right now, Israel is on high alert. So Israelis need you more than ever, soldiers in particular. There is talk of a ceasefire right now with Lebanon. The Israelis are split on whether or not this ceasefire should happen. The army has given its approval. And I will say, if the IDF has given its approval that a ceasefire is viable and is acceptable, then I would tend to believe them. At the same time, I see the arguments against the ceasefire. There are many who are saying that why should we let up on Hezbollah? We need to destroy them completely. We shouldn't give them a chance to regroup because we all know, and I'll tell you this right now, if and when there is a ceasefire, the minute the ceasefire ends, Hezbollah's number one plan of action is to regroup and start figuring out what is their new plan for how to attack Israel, whether it's in 6 more months or 6 more years or 60 years. That is what the goal is going to be. It is not that Hezbollah suddenly, changed their mind and realized we really just want to live peacefully here in Lebanon. So there is a very good argument for not having a ceasefire. You can read the details of what the ceasefire would entail online. The one important point that I want you to leave with is that the mayors of towns in the north of Israel are against a ceasefire. So you would think that residents of the north who've been living in hotels and in apartments all over the country, you'd think they would be the ones who would be most in favor of a ceasefire so they could go home and finally return to their homes in Kiryat Shmona and Metula in the north. They are against a ceasefire for the simple reason that they do not want to move back to a home that is a kilometer away from the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah has not been completely dismantled. We've done a lot to take apart Hezbollah's ability to attack us. We've destroyed many of their rockets. A lot of every house in the south was filled with weaponry. We've destroyed much or most of that, captured it. But there's still a capability there. And the residents of the north who want to go home actually would rather not go home yet. They would rather see this war continue and in their mind see Hezbollah completely dismantled, completely destroyed. So just a sort of a twist there is that the group you would think who would most want to go home and most be ready for the war to be over, already 14 months living out of their homes, they actually want to see it continue. And to be honest with you, I can see their point of view. I'm not sure. Actually, I am sure. I would not want to live in Metula right now. I would not want to live in Kiryat Shmona right now, even if there were a signed ceasefire. Reminding you, there was a ceasefire in 2006 calling for Hezbollah to be above the Litani River. That is exactly what this ceasefire would call for as well. So we're basically reenacting the same agreement we had 18 years ago, which nobody enforced. The United Nations never bothered to enforce Resolution 1701, pushing Hezbollah above the Litani River. What could be different this time is that there is a committee overseen by the US and France that would make sure that Hezbollah is complying. How much that would actually happen, I don't know, but I can see the arguments on both sides and can certainly sympathize with residents of the North who do not want the ceasefire to end. So that was one piece of news. I guess we transitioned without my really meaning to into the news items for the week. That was one of them. The second one is the murder of the Chabad rabbi Tzvi Kogan. There's really not much I can add to this story, which is horrific. Other than that, most Israelis are horrified by this as well. To them, it's yet another example of the far-reaching tentacles of anti-Semitism. We saw it in Amsterdam, 2-3 weeks ago with the pretty much a pogrom after the soccer game. We're seeing it with this attack on the Chabad rabbi now. What I can add, I suppose, is just my own personal insights on Chabad. As some of you know, before we moved to Israel as a family in 2016, in the summer of 2015, my wife Dorit and I pulled our 4 kids out of school and we backpacked around the world for 1 year. Really a budget shoestring trip, living in youth hostels, taking overnight buses, 14 countries in South America, Africa, Southeast Asia. Truly amazing. But along the way, Chabad was our home. Any hole you can imagine around the world, there is a Chabad there and a Chabad family there. We did Yom Kippur at the Chabad of La Paz, Bolivia, Sukkot with one of the biggest Chabads in the world in Cusco, Peru. We had Passover Seder at the second biggest Chabad in the world in Bangkok, Thailand. The first biggest is in Nepal. The largest Seder in the world is in Nepal. in Kathmandu, and the second largest is in Bangkok, and that's where we did our Seder. So Chabad, they really are emissaries. They believe that it is their mission to provide Judaism for Jews wherever those Jews may be, whether it is Cusco or Bangkok or Sydney or Greenwich, Connecticut. I am actually very good friends with the Chabad rabbi in Rebbitzin in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a pretty good pull for a rabbi in Rebbitzin to get compared with all those other places. But I think we should admire Rabbi Tzvi Kogan, Zichrono Livracha, and all he did and the Chabad did to make Judaism available to those Jews who need it wherever they may be. Finally, the third news item probably slipped under the radar for many of you. Certainly, I didn't notice it until it came to my attention, is that Germany charged 4 suspects who have been accused of collecting and holding, stockpiling weapons for Hamas in Europe. So again, Germany is charging 4 suspects who've been stockpiling weapons for Hamas in Europe. And this reminds me of an expression that I've used countless times on this podcast, Efo Hadag Mashtin, which means where the fish pisses. It's one of my favorite Hebrew expressions, where the fish pisses. The fish pisses in its own water. It contaminates its own water. And many Israelis have been saying for a long, eventually Europe will realize, Efo Hadag Mashtin, that for all their protests against Israel, for all their support of Gaza and free Palestine, eventually they're going to realize that the problem is their problem as well. And we're seeing that slowly but surely. And this arrest is yet another example of how even Europe is being affected. That is it for this week's episode. I truly thank all of you for joining me, and the Perlens especially for sharing their thoughts and memories of Yogev, Zichrono Livracha. If you want to get the links for future podcast episodes, you can do that on my website, joelchasnoff.com/podcast. That is also where you can listen to past episodes. It's also where you can support the podcast, which I appreciate. My tour schedule is up at joelchasnoff.com/shows. I've met a lot of you, as I mentioned, on tour next weekend, Thanksgiving in the US, but don't worry, in Canada, it's not. So I will be in Ontario, Oakville, Ontario on Friday night, and in Kitchener, Waterloo on Saturday night. Frankly, I don't even know where that is on the map, but I've got a flight there. One of the most expensive flights I've ever bought, but so be it. I'll be there next Saturday night, but check out joelchasnoff.com/shows so you can meet up with me on the road. I do want to wish all of you in the US a very happy Thanksgiving. And my hope is that next Thanksgiving, we will be able to look back and be so thankful for the amazing things that happened between now and then. Our hostages coming home, the wars in Gaza, in Lebanon being over, the residents of the North returning to their homes, and Israel and Jewish communities around the world living in peace. Man, that would be great if next Thanksgiving we can all be thankful for that. Until next week, all right, next week, it'll be again Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, the live broadcast. So yes, next week, Inside Israel Live will be 9 p.m. Eastern, just like this week. Until then, Lehitraot to all of you, and thank you so much for joining. I'm Joel Chasnoff, signing off. Laila Tov.